What are your thoughts on Pakistan?
Right, I'm afraid you can't mention the UN in this context because the UN is a place where we all flourish as doves, and I'm a dove who's been mugged by reality, as it were. So I kind of, when you speak of Pakistan in the eyes of the beholder, I tend to behold Pakistan with the heart of a dove, but the head of a hawk. And the reason for that, quite simply, is our own experience with relation to Pakistan. And while I don't disagree with anything that my good friend Hussain Haqqani has said, I've known him for a long time, and I think when he speaks of the Pakistan of the poet and the creative writer and the idealistic young person, I'm sure all that is as true. But the Pakistan that I behold from where I sit is Pakistan as it impacts upon India. And there it seems to me that we have some really fundamental issues. First of all, there is the core problem, which in my view is not Kashmir. I think the real problem between us and Pakistan is the nature of the Pakistani state. It is a state which, to paraphrase Voltaire on Prussia, in India the state has an army, in Pakistan the army has a state. And what that boils down to is that whereas in India you join the army to defend the country, in Pakistan you join the army to run the country. They have run the country for 33 years of the 70 that Hussain mentioned, and the rest of the other 37, they've run it from behind a civilian government, making very clear how far that government can go, what the red lines are, pulling the strings as appropriate, and throwing out the governments in question when they dared to go beyond what the military found acceptable. On top of that, the military is present, as Ayesha Siddiqa has demonstrated in her book, not just in the military establishment or when they're ruling in the government establishment. The military is involved in everything. It's involved in real estate, it's involved in import, export, it runs petrol stations, universities, think tanks. They're present in all walks of life, and it's a cradle to the grave profession. Once you get into the army, essentially, once you reach a position of any consequence, you don't really need to retire unless you want to. You can continue doing things that the military assures for you. And that kind of dominance has meant that Pakistan is now the country whose army has the single largest share of GDP of any country in the world. There is no country in the world whose army disposes of a larger percentage of either the government's budget or of its gross domestic product. Now, how does the Pakistani military get away with justifying this disproportionate command of its nation's resources? It can only do so by pointing to trouble on its frontiers, ideally on both, or at least complete quiescence on one side and hostility on the other, so that they have a justification for allowing the military to dominate their society. In these circumstances, we're looking at a situation where whenever India has attempted with as much sincerity as one can muster to make peace, it has always been met with a military response by the military who stands to lose from that peace. So we talk to a civilian government. The civilian government may sometimes be genuinely anxious to move ahead with peace. And then so Mr. Vajpayee makes his bus trip to Lahore. There's 3 months of talk about the spirit of Lahore. And meanwhile, of course, the Pakistani soldiers, not dressed in military uniform, cross into the heights of Kargil, and you know the rest. Or the subsequent peacemaking efforts, Agra was followed by, a few months later, by the attack on our parliament, etc., etc. We can have example after example. When Zardari comes to power and he makes very conciliatory noises, we in turn reciprocate. Their foreign minister is in Delhi to actually discuss visa liberalization. So someone like Hussain Haqqani could have been here more quickly had that worked. But while the foreign minister is in Delhi, 26/11 happens in Mumbai. So that is the situation. We are stuck with talking to a civilian government that is either unable or unwilling to give us the peace we need. And that's the other problem we have, because in the subcontinent, part of the difficulty in our equation is we are a status quo power. There is nothing Pakistan has that we really want. Yes, we do maintain a claim to Pakistan, so-called Azad Kashmir, Pakistan occupied Kashmir as we call it. But my own view is that we maintain that claim essentially in order to have something to give up in a settlement. We are not realistically going to try and claim that back. Indeed, when we actually won some territory in '65, that is territory that belongs on our maps to us. We still gave it back in the Tashkent peace settlement in January '66. So the fact is, this is not a part of Kashmir we realistically are aiming to get back. Therefore, we can truthfully say there's nothing we want from Pakistan except peace. Whereas Pakistan does want something we have, and they have this long-standing claim to the Valley of Kashmir as something they consider the unfinished business of partition. And as long as they have that chip on their shoulder, and as long as they have all the other historical baggage, they will continue doing what they've been doing, which is trying first through conventional warfare and failing, and then trying through militants, terrorists, and other proxies to divide India. There are accounts of how they first thought they could do to India through Punjab, through the Khalistan movement, what we had done to them as they saw it with Bangladesh. When that failed, Kashmir was the next opportunity, and they started sending people across. Today, the Pakistanis have a somewhat more innocent narrative of saying, look, how can you accuse us of being terrorists when we are the biggest victims of terrorism? Yes, but the problem is that those terrorists are homegrown. It's their own chickens coming home to roost. The terrorists whom they have armed, financed, guided, encouraged, unleashed on the hapless Afghans, because after all, the Taliban was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Pakistani ISI, that they continue to send to us, as we know from the chilling evidence we've heard of 26/11 being commanded while it was happening by a handler from Pakistan. All of that evidence is available to us and to the rest of the world, and yet we have this innocence being proclaimed by Pakistan. I'm sorry, it just won't wash. There is no moral equivalence. Yes, sorry, more Pakistanis are dying because of terrorism than Indians are anymore in any particular year in the last few years. But those people are not dying because of people armed, trained, officered, paid for, supplied from India and sent across to Pakistan. They are a homegrown problem, whereas we sadly are losing citizens to terrorists and militants sent from across their border. So there's a fundamental problem. I'm sorry I've taken so long in laying out the diagnosis. What's a prescription? I am not one of those candlelights at Wagah who says we must aim for the better angels of our nature and theirs, because those better angels definitely exist in Pakistan. There are lots of wonderful Pakistanis whom we can all meet with, interact with, etc. But they don't tend to call the shots unless they somehow miraculously get into the military. So we can't do what my friend Manish Hankaraya would want and say, let's have uninterrupted and uninterruptible talks, because if the military and the ISI do unleash the Lashkar-e-Toiba on Mumbai again or another Indian city, we should interrupt talks. We can't talk to people when their own nationals, uncontrolled by them, are blowing up bombs in our country or killing Indians. But what we can do is to try and change the stakes in Pakistan. And the way to do that, it seems to me, is by dramatically opening up people-to-people contact. Let's be unilaterally generous in visas, for example, starting off with specified categories of people. The Hussain Haqanis of the world, writers, artists, diplomats, business people, even business people working for military-run companies. Let's give them a chance to come here, because I've never yet met a Pakistani who's come to India and not fallen in love with the place. They love to be here. They're always, they have the shock of recognition and the dismay of seeing how much more open and exciting and interesting and creative the society is. They want contact with it. Let's not deny it to them. Let them come. The more come, the more care for India. Perhaps the larger will be the constituency for good relations with India. Secondly, let's massively open up on trade as well. The Pakistanis in many ways are the biggest victims of their own negative trade policies in India. I would even encourage military-owned companies to trade with India. The more Pakistani companies, business people, elite institutions there have a stake in good relations with India because they're profiting from it, the less happy they will be if their military fails to rein in the Lashkar-e-Toiba attacks of the future. I know this may sound sort of either naive or nibbling away at the margins, but I'm not sure there's a better solution. I don't think permanent hostility is a policy. It's a mood, not a policy. And I don't think that this uninterrupted and uninterruptible talks make sense, because then you actually surrender your own self-respect by saying we'll talk to you even if your people are coming in and humiliating us and killing us and harming us. So neither policy that we've tried so far can stand by itself. Let us instead, it seems to me, open up the people-to-people contact, try and enlarge the constituency in Pakistan for good relations with India, try and improve the stakes there. And yes, with the World Cup going on, let's play more cricket with them. I think it actually does help change the atmosphere for relations between us. Thank you.